Okay, so let's get things underway. If anybody is still joining, they can join us and pick up as we go. But conscious of everybody's time, so we will get things underway now. Uh, Hello, good afternoon, as they say, good evening, good morning, wherever Sanico's global customer base and global marketing base are joining us from this evening. Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jonathan Viner. I'm your host for today's session, which will take us between 45 to 50 minutes or so to go through the presentation and to address questions to Florencia. So thank you for joining us. I will introduce Florencia in further detail, but we're hugely grateful for her to join us on today's call. So Florencia, thank you very much for taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise on today's topic, which you can see in front of you there, which is formative and summative interpersonal speaking assessment. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts and your perspective on that shortly. Just by way of a couple of brief housekeeping notices on the next slide. So as you'll be able to see when joining the webinar is being recorded and will be published on Sanico's channels. We'll also be sharing the link with everybody on this call and everybody who registered for the original event. Please stay until the end when we'll give you some further details about a free product trial offer from Sanico for you and your institution to enjoy. Just one final housekeeping practicality. Attendees will be muted by default, and please do use the Q&A function to answer any questions. Those questions will obviously be visible to all participants, but yeah, the Q&A function is the way to reach out to us. And after, if there are any problems, and after Florencia's presentation, we will go through and answer any questions that you've got put to her. So please do be thinking questions while she's talking, and we can address those directly with her afterwards. And just a brief word on Sanico. For those of you who don't know the organisation, the business was established in 1961 and is a Finnish edtech business that is entirely focused on providing language learning solutions to K-12, but also to vocational, corporate and higher education settings globally. The business's mission is about helping educators to teach and learn languages more effectively and more efficiently. And as a business, the organisation has customers, you can see there, in over 110 countries, and its solutions are used in 50,000 classrooms worldwide. So a business that knows and understands language educators and has been providing this webinar series over the last couple of years to enable the sharing of best practice in that field. So we're delighted to have Florencia with us today. Just by way of brief introduction, she has a PhD in second language acquisition and teacher education from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I hope I've pronounced that correct. Where she is now the director of advanced Spanish. She's an advanced certified ACTFL Oral Proficiency Interview tester and award-winning educator who's published and presented nationally and internationally on technology integration and research-based pedagogical approaches. Florencia, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand over the mic and the presentation to you. We're looking forward to your presentation greatly, and we'll be back with questions afterwards. So just to reiterate, please use the Q&A function with any questions that you might have, and we can address those with Florencia at the end. Florencia, over to you.
Okay, hi everybody. How's everyone doing? It's so nice to see so many names. I recognize a lot of names from social media. I don't think we've ever met, but it's so nice. I feel like all my friends are here. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for those of you who are joining us from all over the world where it's probably late. Thank you to Jonathan, even though it is 1 a.m. over there. It doesn't look like it. So thank you all so much for being here. So the title of my talk, as you know, is Formative and Summative Interpersonal Speaking Assessments. And that is a big title, right? It's a big topic. But I want to focus on that interpersonal speaking component of our courses. I don't know how your experience has been, but in my experience, interpersonal speaking tends to be the trickiest, right? So when you think about the 3 modes of communication, you have interpretive, presentational, and then interpersonal. Interpretive, the students do relatively well, especially when we think about, for example, students who speak English learning Spanish. You know, there's cognates, sometimes there's other features that help you understand. Presentational, they have some time to prepare, to think about what they're going to say. And then there's interpersonal. Even myself, I'm a native Spanish speaker and I'm now relearning Italian, and I can understand so much. And if I have time to sit down and write, I can write beautifully. And then I start talking with a friend and I sound like I make no sense, and I know it. And why is that? Why is interpersonal so tricky, interpersonal speaking? Well, because it involves several things many times at the same time. So it does involve understanding. So we're processing language, but we have to process it quickly. And then we have to retrieve from our system with the meaning that we're trying to convey. And that is incredibly hard cognitively compared to the other 2 modes. And that's why interpersonal tends to be so tricky. When we think about interpersonal communication, there's 2 key components, and that's what's going to guide what I'm going to be presenting today. So the first one is it has to be a purposeful, meaningful exchange. And I really like the phrase back and forth, back and forth. So whenever I'm trying to determine if something is interpersonal, I think to myself, is there back and forth? And then the other key component to me is that there is an information gap. The interlocutors don't know exactly what the other participants in that conversation are going to say. Of course, sometimes you can anticipate what the person's probably going to say, and that's fine, but you don't know exactly. That means it is not scripted. So for example, if you see an activity like this, right, there's a picture, there's a schedule, there's a menu, and it says, take turns asking each other questions about this. Is that interpersonal? Not really, because there's no purpose to it. I have no reason to pay attention to what my partner is saying, right? So I could say, when does the person have math? And you respond. And if you respond incorrectly, does it matter? Not really, because I'm looking at the schedule already. I know the information. I don't really want you to tell me. I can see it myself, right? So that is not interpersonal communication. Now, there's another type of assignments, and I'm going to show some examples that perhaps resemble a little bit of that, but I want to distinguish them. And that would be what I would call speaking assignments. And the reason why ACTFL when with interpersonal speaking and not just speaking is because we want to emphasize that back and forth exchange of information and not simply producing words in the language, right? And so, for example, if you have an assignment like record a video on Flipgrid and then respond to 2 classmates, is that interpersonal? Well, when you think about it, probably it's more along the lines of presentational with audience participation, right? Because there's probably not going to be a lot of back and forth. One student posts a video, another student responds, and I guess that's the end of it, right? So there was no actual back and forth. And of course, the other potential concern is that it could be scripted or rehearsed. A platform like Flipgrid, if you've ever used it, allows the students to re-record. And especially if you teach online classes, asynchronous classes, or even if you assign Flipgrid to do at home or outside of class, this is what ends up happening, right? The students tend to re-record. Sometimes they tend to script it, memorize it, and then record it. And so it doesn't really feel like in interpersonal conversation would be. Now, does interpersonal communication have to be spontaneous and asynchronous? No, not necessarily. Interpersonal could be asynchronous. And if you are on social media, you know that you get into these back and forth discussions with people, and those are indeed interpersonal. That is interpersonal communication that is asynchronous and written, right? Even an email, long email chains are interpersonal asynchronous communication. Now, even if you say, okay, let's take spontaneous and synchronous and oral, is it bad to prepare? No, I think some preparation is indeed good. And when we're talking about novice and intermediate learners, some preparation is actually necessary. Even advanced speakers, if you go into a job interview, you probably prepare, right? You probably rehearse, and that's still interpersonal communication. Of course, not reading the whole time. If you're going to script everything, imagine what a weird job interview that would be, right? And all you're doing is reading your answers, right? That's not how it works. So there's still a little bit of a spontaneous component to it. And that is, going back to my first slide, that issue of the information gap. You don't know exactly what the other person will say. In terms of assessments, since the talk today is about formative and summative assessments, I do want to emphasize the fact that I follow performance or proficiency-based assessments. What does that mean? That means that I'm looking at what can they do as opposed to what do they know. And this depends on your goals. I'm not going to say it's a bad thing if you do the what do they know, but I do want you to at least consider shifting the focus to what can they do. And so instead of the conversation, the interpersonal activity being about quizzing their vocab or their grammar, it's about, can they express themselves? Can they understand my questions, right? Can they communicate in an interpersonal manner? The performance part of it also reflects that the assessment that you choose to do is not different from instruction. So there's not this clear-cut difference between what you do in class as instruction and then what you do as in assessment. Everything reflects each other, almost to the point where an in-class activity could be the assessment. And so you don't have to always have them completely separated. Now, when we think about assessments, many of us, myself included, think of grades, right? Think of evaluation. And I understand that. I am in a system, in an institution where I have to assign grades to my students, right? So I understand, and we can talk about grades forever, right? The system we're in, I have to assign a grade. So what I try to think about is, how can I assign a grade in a way that I am still reflecting performance? And I'll talk about rubrics a little later today. But it doesn't have to be. I think it's good to do some assessments that don't necessarily have a grade, or at least that they are very, very, very low stakes. And it's mostly to give them feedback and to help them reflect on their progress. And the word progress, I have it in bold there, because when we're learning a language, sometimes it's hard for us to realize where the progress is, because language acquisition is very slow. It's painfully slow. And so sometimes we want results, we want to see like a lot of progress right away. And yes, when you are a true novice, the first year you make a lot of progress that you can see, but then it seems like we get stuck, right, in the intermediate low. But there's progress. And how can we show them that they're making some progress? Of course, we need to have realistic expectations. One semester is not going to be one level, right? So if you have these proficiency benchmarks, just be careful with thinking that just because a year has passed, we should not be at the next level up. Not necessarily, right? So for some students, for most of us, acquisition is very slow. But what about all of the details within their performance that perhaps they're not reflected in the actual levels, but it's still progress. So for example, can they say a little more than they say at the beginning of the semester? Can they understand questions without asking for clarification as often? That is progress. Can they discuss a new topic? That is still progress. So even if the quantity and quality of speech remains about the same, the fact that they can now talk about something else is still progress, and they should see it as such. I am, as Jonathan said, so I am an OPI certified tester, and that is a certification that ACTFL gives, and you learn a lot about interviewing, about assessing somebody's oral proficiency. And so I am very much, in that mindset. I know that other countries follow different guidelines. Whatever guidelines you follow, understanding proficiency affects the questions that you ask, the tasks that you ask the students to do within the assessment, how much scaffolding you're going to need to provide. And of course, it's going to affect the rubrics. I just want to point this out, even if it may be obvious to some of you, because a lot of times we think about proficiency levels as a way to assess, to evaluate the sample, the product, but then we don't think about, does it make sense what we're asking them to do? And in what conditions we're asking them to perform that task? Everything has to make sense for the level. The majority of our students, at least here in the US, are novice to intermediate. We don't have a lot of students who are advanced in the ACTFL scale, although in the case of Spanish in the US, we certainly have a lot of heritage speakers. And in that case, yes, they are already advanced. Many of them are advanced. But I see a lot of novice level learners, because the level 1 and 2 tend to be the biggest ones in many institutions and in many schools. And so we need to understand a novice learner, what they can do with the language when it comes to interpersonal communication. And I do want you to remember these two things. The first one, which is crucial, they are primarily reactive. They depend on their interlocutor to carry the conversation, or they depend on something really structured to carry the conversation. You cannot tell a novice speaker, tell me about your ideal vacation. They're going to get stuck. That's me in Italian, right? Like I can get a few words and phrases, and all of a sudden I am getting frustrated because I know what I want to say, but I can't quite do it, right? Same with talk with a partner about your weekend plans. They're probably going to each say one thing, and they're going to say, good. And then it's like, okay, I don't know what else to do, right? Because they need that interlocutor to carry the conversation. And then relies on rehearsed language, words and phrases. So sometimes they're going to struggle a lot to form a question. That's more at the novice, high, intermediate, low when they start asking questions. And yeah, they need to have these phrases that they can use, this rehearsed language, right? They can't quite create with language yet. That comes at the intermediate level. So when we get to intermediate, or as we approach intermediate, the further away we get from novice, the less we rely on the interlocutor. So as students progress and they get intermediate mid and high and advanced low, they can have a conversation without a whole lot of scaffolding, right? They can do it on their own. They can ask their own questions. Okay, so what I have next is some assessment ideas. So the first one is to take advantage of paired interaction in class. What I would say, though, is to keep in mind that it has to be purposeful. So not just ask each other questions about this picture, or not just ask each other questions about your weekend plans, but there's no point to it, right? There's no point for them to understand what the partner's saying. So always think to yourself, why do they need to pay attention to each other? There's got to be something that they need to do with that information to demonstrate that they did understand and pay attention to each other. And it has to be guided probably even some intermediate learners, they still needed to be guided, but not unnatural. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that sometimes we, as teachers, myself included, we like control a little too much. And so we think we're helping them by guiding them and putting them all of these requirements or things that we want them to focus on or produce or say. But at some point, if you have too many restrictions, it just becomes unnatural. For example, use complete sentences, at least 2 irregular verbs, use 5 words from the vocab list. So at some point, you're paying more attention to those guidelines and restrictions than actually wanting to have a conversation and understanding each other. When we have conversations ourselves, even if you're a monolingual native speaker, you don't always talk with complete sentences. You don't always use irregular verbs. So think about, what are they going to need to accomplish that task, right? To get their message across and to understand each other. That's what we want, right? So that's why you go back to the purposeful. It's not just to practice, but it's actually to exchange information for a purpose. So the example that I have here, which I actually think is in my upcoming book, Common Ground. So in this one, it is very guided because we wanted to give an example for novice interpersonal. And so you see that in step 1, we're giving them input, right? Wakes up at, goes, eats, right? The students are filling it out with their predictions, with what they think is probably true. And then, yes, they added 2 more at the end. So we give them a little bit of freedom to come up with something else. And then they create questions. Yes, in step 2, we give them time to create questions. If they're novice learners, they need that time to create the questions. And then in step 3, they're interviewing the person using those questions. And then take notes, because they're going to need them to see if the predictions they made in step 1 were true or not. So there's a purpose for wanting to understand their classmate. So maybe you're looking at this, and maybe your learners are probably maybe novice, high, intermediate, low. They're a little bit, they can say more, and you're like, this seems very structured, and that's fine. It is very structured because this is an in-class activity, which could be a form of an assessment, and it is for novice learners, right? They need to go little by little, and they need a lot of help. So you can increase spontaneity, where maybe you have them write the questions down, but then you tell them to put that paper away. So they're not just reading the questions, but they had that time to prepare, just like you would prepare before you go to a job interview. Ask 1 follow-up question based on what your classmates shared. So you can give them that guidance, and it's not too unnatural. They just need to come up with 1 extra question to ask, right? So there's ways in which you can build increasing spontaneity. And maybe if you know your students are already very good, that they're not going to need to be writing the questions down. You can skip that altogether, right? There's no problem with that. But I want to emphasize, increase spontaneity gradually. We cannot have, in class, very scaffolded training wheels, and then here comes the assessment, and now they're supposed to be pros at it. It has to match. It has to match. So if we go back to this, well, maybe you keep some of step 1, but maybe you make them write more predictions. You don't have them write down the questions, and then the interview, right? So it's still scaffolded, but now you're taking those training wheels away little by little. A tool that I use a lot because I love it, and because a lot of our courses have a lot of asynchronous components, right? We're not always in person in real time, or even in Zoom, is extempore. And extempore is good even if you don't teach online asynchronous classes. And the reason why I like extempore is because you can create simulated interactions. If you are here in the US and you're familiar with the AP exam, the conversation, or if you've ever taken the OPI, the computer version of the OPI, or if you know about the Apple test here in the US, they all use the same type of technology, which is you hear or you watch a prompt, and boom, the recording starts and you have to talk, right, for a certain period of time. So extempore works the same way. So the students can listen or watch a video, and that would be the left side of that screenshot that you see here. That was a video where I asked them a question, and then as soon as the video stops, the recording starts. The students cannot control when the recording starts. The students cannot pause the recording. They have to answer spontaneously. And so in a way that helps me create that simulated interaction without me setting appointments with each student, right? So I ask them a question, they respond on the spot. Now, you can definitely, and I use it a lot more in terms of a formative assessment, right? So it's not like the big assessment. And what I like is because they have to get better, little by little, they get better at understanding the question without asking for clarification. And also they get more and more comfortable expressing themselves to the best of their abilities. And I tell them that, right? So I'm not going to be grading them on their grammar, on their perfect vocab, right? I just say, just try your best to express yourself. You don't remember the word, think of a different way of saying it, right? Sometimes I even accept gestures because it's a video, right? So I want them to just try their best to express themselves. And at the beginning, it's a little bumpy, right? Because they really want to have it all perfect. But by the time they did the, question 10, 20, they get used to the fact that they're just kind of talking to me as best as they can. And what I really like is that it gives you sort of that evidence, right, of their growth. And so at the beginning, you see how their answers are maybe 20 seconds, right, something like that. Some of them can say a little bit more. And then by week 4, they were recording answers. I mean, some of the students were talking for like 2 minutes straight. And I was like, look how amazing you're doing. If you look back at your video and then you look now, how much more you can say. And it also allows you to give them feedback. You can record the feedback, you can record a video with feedback, and the feedback can be a follow-up question. Feedback doesn't always have to be, you pronounced this word wrong. Doesn't have to be that. The feedback can be a follow-up question like, oh, you talked about this, I would love to know more. Or what is your dog's name? I always ask about dogs. If you know me, you know I'm a dog crazy lady. So yeah, when their students are telling me about their pets, and sometimes they show me their pets, which is really cute, then I always ask them about it. But what the students could do is, if you ask them several questions, and I do for each set, they probably are not, at least my students are probably not going to review every single question and answer and feedback. So what you can do is tell them to review one question, one answer. And if you gave them feedback on that particular answer, then maybe they can write a little forum post, a little something just reflecting on it. Maybe they need to expand, right? They answer the question, but they gave me a 1-sentence, very broad answer. Tell me more. I tell them that, cuéntame más. So then that could be part of the revision and expansion, which doesn't have to be spontaneous, but it's just part of this, like helping them see, reflect on their progress, right? Okay, other interlocutors, I like to always, if I can, as much as I can, incorporate it, because I think it's important for the students to not think that Spanish, the language I teach, only exists with me and their classmates, and that's it, right? So interacting with other people in the target language, to me, is a wonderful way of doing summative interpersonal. And so I use platforms where the students can pair up with conversation partners. I've used Talk Abroad for years, almost it's going to be a decade. Language Amigo, have been using them for the past 2 years. I piloted Boomerang and it's great, but it's very, very similar to Talk Abroad. And so at this point, just based on a very, very tiny difference in pricing, I just went with Talk Abroad, and I'm staying with Talk Abroad. But Language Amigo is a little bit cheaper than Talk Abroad, only available for Spanish right now. And then what the students like about it is that they schedule one session with one amigo, and that's the person they see every week. So they already know the day and time, and they already know the person, which there's benefits to talking to the same person. Talk Abroad, I like the variety. They have speakers from all over Latin America, and so the students get to talk to people from many different countries, which is a great experience as well. In Language Amigo, they send them feedback too. So the conversation partner sends feedback to the students. If you don't want to use any of these platforms, I teach college, so I understand it's different, right? If you teach high school or middle school, many of these Talk Abroad does high school for sure. I don't know about Language Amigo. And Boomerang even does elementary school. So some of these platforms do offer for other ages, but I understand if you don't feel comfortable, and they're not free, right? So that's another thing you have to think about. You could have invited speakers virtually, right? So if you know friends who are native speakers, then maybe you can tell them, hey, can you come to my class? And they can ask you some questions. And nowadays with Zoom everywhere, right, we can just zoom in and they can ask the invited speaker questions. In the example that we have, and same with asynchronous interviews, which you can do on Flipgrid, because Flipgrid is so easy to share and people can just post the videos. The students can post videos of questions, and then the guest speaker records the answers. So you don't have to coordinate schedules, and the person can just record the answers, you know, on their own time. And I think the example that we have on Common Ground is the purpose of it is to guess where the person is from, right? And so they ask questions, the person gives them some clues. Obviously, the person knows that you cannot tell them where you're from. It gives them some clues, right? And then the students need to guess and then say why, right? Just demonstrating that they understood the person. If you can have them do follow-up questions, even better. But of course, that's going to depend on your guest. In the case of the Talk Abroad project, I just wanted to show you very quickly just how much of preparation it takes, right? It's multiple steps. It's not just go have conversations and have fun, right? It is part of a bigger project. The conversations themselves, we don't grade them, right? It's not like I'm gonna go in and watch the conversation and give them a grade. I'm not, but they're using that information for something. And the reason why we don't grade the conversations themselves for Talk Abroad is because we want the students to feel comfortable without thinking that somebody's going to be judging their language skills. In the case of Language Amigo, for example, what I tell the students is, as long as you're making an effort to communicate in Spanish, you get full credit. So if I see that the student is not talking, if I see that the student is just using English, their grade gets lower. It's not like they get 0, but I want them to demonstrate just some effort to communicate. And the vast majority of them do, and they love it, right? They love talking to somebody, as they say, a real native speaker, because I guess I'm not, but you know how it is. And then this summative, I love instructor-led interviews. And it could be because I am an OPI interviewer, but I think that they are fantastic. Whether you want to do more than one or you can only do one, I really like instructor-led interviews for students who are in the novice range. To me is a must, because they depend on another interlocutor who knows a little bit more to carry the conversation. And then even intermediate, probably if we're talking about intermediate high and up, then they can do it in pairs recorded, and then I can evaluate it. But even intermediate low, they need somebody to get those questions going and to help them out, right? And so what I do is I meet in small groups. If you can do individually, great. I have big classes, so 2 or 3 students at a time, 20, 30 minutes. Of course, depends on their level. Some of them can say more, some of them can say less. And we have a conversation, right? So I tell them about your studies. What do you think of online classes? Because they take online class, right? So I ask them questions. When they don't understand, they tell me, and so I rephrase. And that is one thing that if you put 2 novice learners or intermediate low learners together and one of them doesn't understand, it is very difficult to rephrase, to circumlocute when you are novice, high, intermediate, low, right? It's very hard to help your partner and make yourself understood. But if you have a more advanced speaker who can sort of help out, then the conversation is more successful. And I have to tell you this, I just finished teaching the winter course a couple weeks ago, and one of the students wrote in the surveys that her favorite part of the course was the interview. Even though it was the oral exam, it's the first time I see that somebody says their favorite part is the oral exam, because she said, I had fun and I got to talk to you. It just feels like a conversation. I'm not rating them, I'm not quizzing them on vocab, I just want to know about them. So ideally what you can do is, if you want to maintain the theme of being purposeful, getting to know each other can definitely be a purpose, of course. But if you want to frame it, you can frame it around the purpose of deciding or recommending something. So maybe you tell them that you are, the school is going to be creating a mural, right? And so you ask them some questions to see what they think, what their preference is, who should be in it, what should be in it, what colors, right? Where, like, you can ask them whatever questions you want to ask them. But then it feels like you are having this conversation for a purpose. Or deciding on volunteering opportunities, right? You tell them there are these 2 opportunities that you could participate in. So I'm going to ask you some questions to see which one might be a better fit for you. And so you ask them some questions to determine that. Planning a field trip. I mean, there's many other things that you can end up deciding or recommending. What I would like you to remember is that responses don't exist by themselves. The task is going to affect performance. How you ask the question affects performance. So it's different to ask, tell me about your studies, and you leave it open, versus what do you study? If you ask, what do you study? And the student just says, math. Well, I can't follow that student. The student answered the question. Right? So you need to think about, what am I asking that is going to help them show me everything that they want to show me, right? To tell me as much as possible. In terms of the questions, a question that I get is, do you give them the questions ahead of time? No. They should be predictable topics. Obviously, everything is going to be related to the course. And in fact, I asked them a lot of questions that they were asked in extempore. So the questions are not like, whoa, what is this? I've never talked about this before, right? They've had that preparation. These are novice high learners. They need that rehearsed language, and that's okay. In terms of the instructions, I do tell them what types of questions. So for example, I tell them, a word you're going to hear me say a lot is cuéntame, tell me. So they already know that's coming, right? I also tell them if I'm going to allow other languages or not. In this case, I don't. I tell them, if you say something in English, I'm going to ask you, can you please explain to me what it is? Can you give me an example, right? I kind of help them out a little bit. And then outside resources, this is the summative assessment, and I want to know what they can do on their own. I don't want to know what Google can do for you. So I tell them, please don't type anything or don't write anything, don't look anything up. Just do your best with what you know. And they do actually really well. It's just that they want to do perfect, and that's not what I'm aiming for anyway. So let's talk about the rubrics. Some basic guidelines. If you can, try to tailor it to the task, right? So they need to make sense for what you're going to be asking them to do. Of course, avoid too much overlapping between criteria, so the students are not penalized twice for whatever did not work out. And decide what matters most. It doesn't have to be square boxes. All rubrics are the square thing, right? Where you have these many criteria and this many points. It doesn't have to be. And I'll show you the example of the one that I use. And always remember that there is no perfectly objective rubric, and there is no perfect rubric. A rubric is like a house, and it's never done, and you always want to keep changing something. So these are the ones that I use. The first criterion is ability to provide information, that they understood my question and they're able to tell me something. Criterion 2 is comprehensibility. And I know for some people that's a little bit controversial, like who determines comprehensibility? What I tell them is, I need to understand you. I'm used to what you sound like. I'm used to, second language learners. I need to understand you. That's what it is, right? And then the third criterion, as you can see, is worth less. And that is ability to ask questions. So in my interview, at the end of the interview, I tell them to ask me questions, and that is always gets very fun, and see if they can ask a variety of questions, not just yes, no questions, or not just how are you, what's your name? You know, they know that they're not gonna ask me that anyway, but that's only worth 2 points, right? So I don't wanna put too much weight just on the questions. My main thing is, can they tell me information and can I understand them? And then 100% to me is not perfect. They can get 100% on the summative assessment just by performing at level. And I know some of you, if you're familiar with IPA rubrics, are like, what? They need to exceed expectations. No, not in my class. In my class, 100% is at level. What am I aiming for? What I have been aiming for in the class. That to me is 100%. If they do better than that, fantastic. They get lots of kudos, but they don't get extra points for that. So at this level, communication breakdowns are going to happen, and it's fine. You can still get 100% even if there are some communication breakdowns. You're going to get 100% even if all you tell me is a few simple sentences. And you're able to ask questions before formulaic, you get 100% for that criterion as well. They don't have to be perfect questions. If sometimes the verb is in infinitive, that's okay. I understood what they ask. For this level, that is what is expected of this level. And I want to conclude with a couple of raters tips. So I've been rating for Apple. I was a rater for STAMP, if you know, in the US. I'm an OPI rater. I'm an OPI C for English rater. And all of these trainings, I'm an AP rater as well. All of these trainings to be a rater and rating people talking. The two things that they all have in common is, even if the rubric is analytic, you should rate holistically. What does that mean? That means that you should not be writing down every mistake that they've made. You should not be, oops, here I did not understand this one word, so now I have to take a point off, right? Overall, how did they do? How did they perform overall? What kind of patterns do you notice? Patterns such as, sometimes they give me 2 words, sometimes they give me a little phrase, sometimes they struggle to give me more, right? That is a pattern. And also, don't rate the breakdown. What does that mean? That means that it's so easy for us, for me at least, that you listen to somebody and you notice, oh my goodness, that did not make any sense. And then all of a sudden you feel like everything else is a lower level just because of that one question that they struggled with. And so don't just rate that breakdown. Think of overall how they did, focus on what they were able to do. So thank you all very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Jonathan, I told you I was going to go over time. I knew it. So you can find me on Twitter. You can watch my videos on unpacking language pedagogy on YouTube. And the last thing that's there, go.illinois.edu/TLTL. That is my website for technology, for language teaching and learning. And that's where I post slides and recordings, if we can have the recording, but at the very least, I'm happy to post the slides.
Fantastic, Florencia, thank you so much. I'm sure there will be no shortage of questions. So either in the, I know some people are posting questions in the chat, or within the Q&A would be perfect. And just confirm for us as a question that you're happy to post the slides that you've just been through on your go.illinois.edu URL that you've provided.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And also, I realized, I'm sorry, I just realized now, I was supposed to mention that Sanaco has a alternative, right? So if you don't use extempore, sorry.
Okay, I wasn't going to mention it, but thank you for doing so.
Yes. So if you are a Sanaco user, there is a way to do instructor controlled questions.
Okay.
Yes. I see the question. So will we get the PowerPoint? Yes, I'm going to post it on my site.
And we will circulate the recording to the email address that everybody has provided. So there are some questions coming in the Q&A, which is great. Let me just go through those. Florencia, a question that kind of sprung to mind as you were talking. For me, and you talked a little about kind of viewing the work that your student has done in the round and not kind of picking out individual mistakes. I guess, how do you then feed that back to the student? When they've done their assessment, you've assessed it. How can you give some kind of examples about how you might feed back to and the kind of what looks like good feedback and what is more difficult feedback for students to digest?
What is difficult feedback for the students to digest? I'm not sure I'm understanding fully the question. I'm sorry.
I guess what kind of I guess some advice and tips to people on the webinar about having assessed the work. How do you go about feeding back to the students? What does good practice look like?
So what I would probably say, it depends on which task, or if it's like if we're talking about just an extempore question, or if it's the summative interview with me. But so I just shared, although I think I shared it the wrong way. I'm going to put the link here. So that link there is the link to the full wording of my rubric.
Great.
And so that in a way helps, because I tell the student, if they don't get full credit, if they get full credit, I still write everything that I loved about it, right? So how much I was able to understand them, how much more they're saying, right? I still, lots of praise, right? So I still do. If some things, I felt like they struggle with some things, like let's say it says that most things were comprehensible, and when communication breakdown occurred, the student was just not able to rephrase, right? What I do is I reference that. And so I tell them, when I asked you about this and you said X, and I didn't understand you, and I asked you again, and you just said, and that's usually when the student says, no sé, I don't know, right? They don't even try to rephrase. Even if I help them again, like, can you give me an example, right? I try to, like, come on, don't give up yet. And they just give up. I said, okay, no hay problema, or no problem. And then we move on. I just make a mental note of it, right? That the student is just unable to make themselves understood. And then I try to reference that particular example. And if I can, I tell them, I think at some point, if the student just gives up, I don't know how much they're going to really process my feedback. I think they are already anticipating, that's how they did. But sometimes I can, at least if it's live, at the end of the interview, we can have a little conversation in English, and I even help them, right? Like, I think you were trying to say this, right? Oh, okay, you can say this or you can say that. When it comes to the extempore ones, I give them the feedback. Like, you said this word in English, this is how you see it in Spanish, or you can also say this. Like, I help them with circumlocution strategies for them. Yes. There's
a question in the Q&A from Donna asking whether you ever interrupt speakers. Do you wait for them to finish speaking before giving that feedback?
Oh, no. I don't interrupt them to give them feedback. I even wait to try to understand as much as possible. And then if I'm really struggling, then I say, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. Did you mean this or that? Right? Sometimes I do that. But I wouldn't interrupt them, because sometimes there could be a breakdown but then as they elaborate, then I'm able to understand. So there's no need to interrupt them. But definitely I'm not evaluating while we're talking. While we're talking. And I just need to understand them, just like you would talking to anybody else who you're not evaluating. Yeah. I would. Now, I do interrupt if they're talking too much and I'm running out of time. Then I do, and I tell them it's fantastic. It's a good thing. It's in the instructions that it's a good thing if I need to interrupt you because you're talking too much.
Okay. There's another question from Zahid around nervousness with your users. How do you either, I guess, about nervousness about having a conversation that is being graded or assessed in some shape or form, or simply in terms of using the technology? Do you have any tips for colleagues about handling that nervousness with students?
It's a good question. I try to put them at ease by just smiling, telling a little joke. I show them my dog. My dog is always with me. I try to put them at ease that it's going to be an informal conversation. And I understand that they're nervous. I even share with them, like if they're extra nervous, they usually reach out to me ahead of time, right? Like, I'm really worried about, okay, let's talk about it. And I even sometimes reassure them. I'm like, you're doing fantastic on extempore. You have nothing to worry about. Like, it will be just like that. So you're okay. Or I even tell them myself, if you ask me these questions in Italian, it would take me a while to answer. So I completely understand what's going through your head. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that a lot of it is natural nervousness of speaking another language with somebody and having to respond on the spot, and some of those jitters will just never go away, right? Completely. Yeah. But at least just to put them at ease based on their performance so far. This is why you need a lot of these formative assessments, that they're going to be doing just fine in the higher stakes assessments.
One other question, just conscious of time to squeeze everything in. There's a question from Amanda who asks about assessment techniques to use with elementary students who are kind of beginning their language learning journey. Do you have any advice for her?
It's a good question. I don't teach that age group, so I feel like my advice may or may not make a lot of sense, but I would probably keep it simple and keep it more tangible, like on the spot, playing a game or naming something. Just maybe tap into their creativity, right? And not make it so just like you would do an activity in class, right? Think of the same way, but now maybe you're doing this in smaller groups, right? That's what I would probably say. And of course, keep in mind that something like college student, high school students, we can tell them, keep it all in Spanish or keep it all in the target language.
Yeah.
So when they're first learning, elementary school children, it's completely normal for them to start mixing languages, right? And that sometimes they don't even realize. It's just like, it's those things, of course, you need to be lenient, and your rubric, so to speak, is going to look a lot different for you. But I would probably say, think of in-class activities and try to mimic that into an assessment, right? So if you do a game or if you do stories, right, then keep it the same. Keep it the same format and the same type of content.
I'm going to ask one final question, but thank you just to everybody for the offers of help, offers of support, and just the great threads and conversations that are building in the chat. So thank you very much for that. Florencia, just one final question for me. You've been asked about whether you can share your email address. I don't know if you're happy to do so. If you are, please drop it in the chat, or I guess people can direct message you through Twitter or comment on a YouTube video or through the website. What's the best way for anybody to get hold of you if they want to?
I'm going to post it there. I don't mind. I really don't mind, but I have to be honest. Sometimes I get a lot of emails and I may not get back to you right away. That's all I want to say. And I don't want anybody like feeling offended about that. Definitely Twitter, Facebook, YouTube are easier places probably to contact me. But if it's something like maybe you just want to send me an email, I have no problem with that. And you can even just Google me and you'll find my email. So it's not like it's a big secret, but just please don't be offended if it takes me a while to get back to you. That's all. I feel so bad, but yeah.
Great. And for anybody asking about proving their attendance to this webinar, if you respond to us, we don't send out certificates to everybody, after, of course, but if you do want us to do that, then respond to the email which will be following this communication with your recording of the webinar. Florencia, thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. That was truly inspiring, and you can see from the feedback in the chat how valuable colleagues found it. I'm just going to hand over to Juho from Sanako, who can to detail what happens next, what you'll be getting next from Sanako before we bring things to a close. Florencia, over to Juho, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. So this is Juho Isola from Sanako, here from Helsinki, Finland. Thanks for everyone joining the webinar today. Just a quick word on what's next. So keep an eye on your email inbox. So all the people who registered for the event, even though you wouldn't be here live, will get the recording of the webinar, a video link. It will be uploaded to YouTube, and you will receive the link to your email. In the same email, you will get information about the upcoming webinars organized by Sanako, and also the instructions how to access a free trial for Sanako Connect platform, which is a browser-based language teaching solution, so a pretty holistic solution. You can do synchronous lessons and asynchronous lessons classes in the same solution, covering a lot of features, similarly as the tools that Florencia showed and described in her presentation. So a very handy tool for speaking-based exercises, assessment, collecting student recordings, and then teachers are also able to add in time-coded feedback to the student recording. So it's a very handy tool to create a kind of like a feedback loop to give a very efficient feedback for students, especially for speaking-based practices. So there will be an email most likely tomorrow or the day after. And in addition to that one, I would recommend you to check Sanako's webpage at sanako.com. You will also find a page there that gives contact details for our local partners. So Sanako has customers in 100 countries. We usually work with local expert companies who work with schools, universities, and know the local processes of acquiring software, the local IT, data security rules, and these kind of things. So they are the local educational expert that can help you. And feel free to ping them out, send an email to them and request more information about Sanako's products. So we of course have multiple products for different needs, for different educational levels and segments. So I would recommend that you check them out if you wanna have a local assistance. And feel free to send an email to info@sanako.com anytime. If you have any questions, we're here to help you. And yeah, anyways, the next step is keep an eye on the email inbox, and you will see the recording link and the instructions for the Sanako Connect trial.
Fantastic. Brilliant, Juho. Florencia, one final question. A moment for a shameless plug. There is a question in the Q&A about the title of your book, so we'll give you the final word, and you can give us the name of your book and any relevant links for people to buy on Amazon or wherever before we go.
I'll post it in the chat.
Amazing.
And I saw Stephanie said buy her book. I love it. You're so good.
Amazing.
I promise I did not pay her to say that.
And you have the link already ready to paste into the chat.
Yeah, the link is on the chat. Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom, co-author with Maris Hawkins.
Fantastic. And thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Florencia, in particular, for a fantastic presentation. And
thank you.
As
thank you for the
said,
invitation, and thank you all for all the participants. Wonderful audience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And do keep an eye out, as you heard, for the link in your email for the recording. And we hope to see you on Canara again soon. Thanks everybody for your time. Have a great day, and we hope to speak to you soon. Thanks ever so much. Goodbye, everybody.